Okay, we can go ahead and start. Thanks to everybody for logging in tonight. I'm very pleased to see this many folks in our Mountain Zoom series. Um, we have Tonight we have Dr. Jeanine Davis, and I'm very pleased to have her here. She's Associate Professor and Extension Specialist with North Carolina State University. Her research focuses on culinary medicinal herbs, non-timber forest products, hemp, hops, truffles, and other specialty crops. And she's also the lead author of the book Ginseng or Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals, which is a book that's on my shelf back at my extension office right now. Tonight, she's going to talk to us about truffles in the Southeast, give us an overview of truffles, talk about North Carolina State University research, and then also the state of the industry. And for those of you who didn't hear my announcement earlier, I know we have people from Kentucky and Virginia. So if you don't mind in the chat box, if you could just type what county and what state you're in, we would sure appreciate that. So Dr. Davis, thanks for your time, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Phil, and it's a pleasure to see so many people interested in learning more about truffles. And it's a very exciting time for truffles, and North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky are some of the lead states in the eastern part of the country. So great combination right now of people we have tuning in for this. What I'm going to do is I shut down my chat and looking at participants when I'm giving a presentation. So Phil, I'm going to ask you that if a question comes up in the chat box that I need to address right away, just go ahead and cut in and we'll handle that. Otherwise, if you leave the questions to the end, then I'll open the chat box back up and we can go at it with the questions.
Okay, we'll do it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, otherwise I get distracted. All right, let me pull that up. Much easier when I close about a half dozen windows. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. So I have been giving this talk a whole lot this past year. So I'm so pleased to see so many people excited about truffles and what's happening with this. But as extension people, there's a lot of cautions that we need to give to people. So let's go on and tell you what's going on. That's interesting. I've been giving talks all day today, and depending on whose Zoom account we're into, how my PowerPoints work is a little different. So somebody put in the chat box about the chocolate truffles. Yes, those are really delicious too. But today we're going to focus on the fungi type truffles, which is in that lower photograph. Although I have been at conferences where the chefs have made us chocolate truffles that include the black Perigord truffles. So truffles are a mycorrhizae. So it is a fungus living in association in a symbiotic relationship with a host plant. In the case of the truffles, it is usually a tree or a shrub that is going to produce the truffles that we are interested in producing. So the black Perigord truffle grows around and partially into these roots, and you will, that's where you will find them. And they are symbiotic, and this is kind of important to keep in mind, and it's something we as horticulturists struggle with a little bit sometimes. In order for that mycorrhiza to have a purpose, it needs to be there to supply minerals to that tree. So that's something to think about when we care for the tree, to not over fertilize the trees that we're growing so that the mycorrhizae have a purpose. And of course, in return, the tree then supplies carbohydrates made through photosynthesis to the fungi. And you'll see in the top there, that is a microscopic image of the truffle fungi growing on the roots, and you can see why we refer to them as corn dogs. So that's what we look for when we're looking to see whether our roots have been inoculated and encapsulated. So this is all about the fungus and the host trees. And truffles, first of all, there's lots and lots of different kinds of truffles, and different truffles grow in association with different tree species. This is Lois Martin from Tennessee. She runs one portion of the Truffle Dog Company, and that's her dog Monza that hunts truffles for us. And these two play a very critical role within our program for us. So we're going to talk mostly about the wild Perigord or black Perigord truffles, because this is the one that there is the most interest in producing in the United States, actually around the world. And it is the one that most people are familiar with. So when you buy truffle oil or you order a risotto with truffles, that is almost always with a black Perigord truffle. And these have been harvested in Europe from the wild for thousands of years. I mean, there's references back to the Romans with their truffles. And in France, these black truffles are gathered at certain times of year from the forest, from the wild. I have a cousin and her daughter who live in France, and they shared pictures and videos of that taking place this past year. But natural populations within the wild have declined over the past few centuries very dramatically. And there's lots of theories on why this is happening. And we're not going to get into that at this point in time. Just know that those populations are declining. So people have been trying to cultivate these for a long time. And back in the 1800s, people would collect acorns from places in the wild forests where truffles were found. They'd plant that acorn, they'd let it turn into a seedling, then they would hope it had been inoculated, and they would move it to grow somewhere else. And sometimes this worked, and sometimes it didn't. It was pretty iffy. The major black Perigord truffle production areas now are in France and Italy, of course. Spain is a huge player. Australia is doing very, very well in this industry, and I have friends that have gone over there for the harvest seasons to work. Now, this is all for cultivated. Chile, China, United States, South Africa, and most recently I have added the United Kingdom to this list. And this is a truffle orchard that used to exist in Tennessee. This was Tom Michael's orchard. As I said earlier, there is more than one kind of truffle. The genus tuber is the one best known for truffles. There are some truffles within other genuses, but we usually think of tuber. And there are over 100 different kinds, but only a few of these are really considered delicacies. There's quite a few of them that you can eat, you just really wouldn't care to. But let's go over the ones that are really considered delicacies. This is the Italian white truffle, and it is the most valuable of all the truffles. It goes for sometimes up to $4,000 a pound. And it's got an intense garlicky kind of flavor to it. I have only had it once at one of our truffle conference dinners. I happened to sit at a table with the lead person in the organization, so I was one of the few that got to taste it. It is, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been successfully cultivated on any kind of commercial scale. The French black Perigord truffle is the one that we're most interested in. That's tuber melanosporum. My staff and I call this tuber mel. So I'm seeing if I can move this one panel out of the way. There we go. It is the most famous truffle. This is the one that we're trying to grow all over the world. It is native to Europe, mostly to France and northern Spain. It's sometimes also called the winter black truffle because it is harvested in the winter. And there's no good way to describe the flavor. It is very complex, and it is as much the aroma as the flavor. So this winter, around Christmas time, January or so, if you have the opportunity, go to a fine restaurant, or I don't know if we're even going to fine restaurants there. We aren't going to be sitting outside in January, are we? Um, if you can get a real black Perigord truffle, a good one, and taste it, like get a risotto made with black Perigord truffle, because I really can't describe the flavor. Be careful of most truffle oils. If I can afford the truffle oil, or if I'm willing to pay the price, it's not real truffle oil. So when people gift me real truffle oil, they're these little teeny tiny bottles, that cost like $50, $60. That's the real stuff. And I've already mentioned the places that they're grown, and we often get $800 to $1,000 a pound for them. This is the Burgundy truffle, which there's a lot more interest in this one now because it is harvested in the summer and fall. So our growers are able to extend their season of production, not just in the winter, but also in summer and fall. It is very good. It is a milder flavor than the black Perigord, but it still has that same truffly, kind of musty aroma to it, which is very attractive. And so people enjoy these. It can also be cultivated in colder climates. So we're doing better with this one up in like New York and Michigan than maybe we do with the black Perigord. And it is the third most valuable at $400 to $800 a pound. Then we have the white truffle, the tuber borkii, which 5 years ago we just kind of brushed off, didn't say very much about it. But this one has really come onto its own in North Carolina now. It is native to Europe, but there is a group working with NC-A&T State University here in North Carolina that have successfully inoculated this on loblolly pines, and we now have Burwell Orchard, Burwell, are they calling it orchard? That is successfully producing these on a very large scale. So what we have learned is they are much easier to grow. You don't need to make all of the modifications to the soils that I'll tell you about later with the black Perigord truffle. They're super prolific. They're really big. They're fast, much faster to produce, and they're pretty good. So at our truffle conference that we had in February, I brought some of these and brought them home to cook with and was very pleased with them. And these are a real bargain at $400 to $500 a pound. Then we also have native truffles that are worth mentioning. Some of you, if you're from the West Coast, you might have already heard about the black truffle. And the one they're referring to there are these Oregon truffles. And there's a whole industry of wild harvesting those truffles from like Northern California up north to British Columbia. It is very structured. I think now that people need to do a lottery or they get tickets to be able to do this, so they don't have too many people going out in the forest. There used to be a lot of damage done by the way people harvested these. They would just rake until they found them, and I think there's a lot more control over them. They're very good. They go for about $180 a pound, and I think that we now have some people that are producing these in orchards. The ones that we're going to find in our part of the country are the tuber lyonii, the pecan truffle, and this from the University of Georgia has had an extension leaflet on pecan truffles forever. And when I would mention these to chefs like 10, 15 years ago, they would just poo-poo them. They wanted nothing to do with them. But now this whole movement for local foods and wild foods has really changed their mind. And people that have these are able to sell them very readily. And they're often found at pecan orchards. I've talked to some pecan growers who just lament all the years that they threw these things away when they could have been selling them. But like I said, there really wasn't a market for them until quite recently. And these are pretty ubiquitous. We find them all over now that we know what we're looking for. And they usually grow in association with pecan and oak trees. And there's some work going on in Florida that shows they grow with other trees also. And there's the common eastern truffle. I don't hear about this very much from people other than those who are really heavy into the wild food movement, but there are some efforts underway right now, at least in North Carolina, to increase demand for this, to introduce it to the chefs, teach people that this is desirable, because I'm sure you're seeing the same thing that I am, that we have so many people out foraging mushrooms right now of all different kinds. They just want to add this to the mix. But this evening, we're going to focus on growing the black Perigord truffle. So we need a host. And most common in nature, in Europe, those were usually associated with the oak trees. And that's what most people in Europe think about is oaks and truffles. But they will also grow with the filberts. And the person we can really thank for starting this whole movement of growing black Perigord truffles in the United States is Franklin Garland of Garland Truffles in Hillsborough, North Carolina. This has been his lifelong effort, and I've known Franklin for probably 28 years minimum. He trained under one of the lead wild truffle experts out at Oregon State University, and then came to his home in North Carolina and tried to build this industry. This is what he does. If you ever get a chance to attend one of his workshops or go to one of his special days where you go to his farm and you spend the whole day learning about truffles, it's worth the money that he charges for it. He is a bit of a character, but he really knows his stuff. So in the United States, because when you grow truffles on filberts, they come into production much faster than they do on oak trees. Of course, being Americans, we want everything quickly. We chose to go with the filberts. So our early industry in the early 2000s was all based on filberts. So remember again, we're bringing a non-native species over here, so we've got to do some things to make the conditions right for them. I do say that it wants areas where the ground doesn't usually freeze solid, but in my experience, because I'm in the western part of North Carolina, I've had the soil freeze solid 3-4 inches down, and my truffles have been okay, except for those that are near the surface. Those ones near the surface will often suffer for freeze damage, and there's just not much we can do about that. The soil types, it seems to prefer a loamy soil, sandy loam. We have done pretty well with a lot of clay in our soil. There was question about that. We have not had much success yet on the coastal plain. So we're still waiting to learn about that. The next point is the one that's the most important. These truffles need a very, very high soil pH in order to fruit. And in a lot of our region, particularly where I am here in North Carolina, our soil pH is really low. So it is a struggle to get our pH up over 7 and keep it over 7. And I'll talk about some of the research that we're doing to remedy that, which is why there's interest in some of these truffles that don't need a pH quite so tall or so high. But in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, we do have to lime very heavily. I know there's probably some areas in Tennessee and Kentucky with more alkaline soils that it might not be such a struggle. And it does need a very good soil drainage. So there are a number of different ways to grow truffles, and depending on what expert you talk to, they're going to give you different advice, particularly the experts coming from Europe. When they first came over and saw how we were growing truffles, they were appalled. They told us we were doing it all wrong. But I work a lot with new crops, and I work a lot with taking crops that are not native to where we live. And we often have to do things kind of weird in order to make something produce in an area that it is not well adapted to. And I think that might be the case with truffles too. So Franklin Garland had studied truffle production all around the world. He studied how to grow it. He donated all of my first trees for my first orchards, so I followed his system. No matter whose system it is, you're inoculated trees. Now you're buying trees that are already been inoculated with the truffle. I have never asked specifically how it's done because I've wanted to be supportive of those nurseries. It could be as simple as buying a truffle and throwing it in a blender with some water and dipping the roots in. I don't know, like I said, I have left that to those nurseries, but we now have enough other nurseries started that it can't be too difficult. But the nurseries are getting $20 to $25 a tree. So these inoculated trees are planted in late fall or early spring. What Franklin suggests is that you lay down a polypropylene landscape fabric, so it's woven and it's breathable, to do weed control for the first several years. So we just buy silt fencing, and that's what you see in that top photograph. We've just laid out silt fencing, pinned it down with landscape pins, burned our holes in, and planted our inoculated seedlings. Then you want to keep that orchard weeded and mowed or clean cultivated. That's not something we do much in my mountainous area because of erosion issues, but when we get down in the Piedmont, they often don't let grass grow in between the rows to reduce competition with those trees. And then do not fertilize. We want to not give those trees everything that they need so that the trees will seek it from the mycorrhizae. At the last big conference I was at, there's a little bit of science right now that's questioning that, but I haven't seen enough evidence yet to change my recommendation. Watering, a lot of the failures of some of our early orchards was because people did not install irrigation systems. We put in drip lines for those first couple years that are laid either right on top of or right below that landscape fabric. And then when we pull off that silt fencing or landscape fabric, then we have put our irrigation up. We've put on micro sprinklers so that we get a better reach and have those raised up 12 to 18 inches. That bottom point that I make about the eastern filbert blight is crucial. You need to be scouting those orchards for any sign of eastern filbert blight. You need to expect to get it, prune out anything that looks suspicious, and use protective sprays. And then in time, this is what you hope to find. We usually find our first ones around November. Now, traditionally, pigs were used to sniff out truffles because female pigs are attracted to truffles because their odor is very much like a pig pheromone for sex. So they're looking for this because it smells desirable to them, but they want to eat them. And most people find pigs a little difficult to keep. So now most of us use dogs, but you need a good scent dog, and many of our truffle conferences offer sessions on how to select a dog for this purpose. You want one that's a little bit obsessive compulsive. There are good training programs, and some people will go ahead and buy certain breeds of dogs and buy them already trained, and then they have to train the owners, of course. But yeah, most everybody now does use a dog to search out these truffles. So this sounds pretty easy. I mentioned this is Franklin Garland's, one of his orchards that he's had in the past. He sells these filbert seedlings, and in the early 2000s, it looked like, wow, this is a piece of cake. We can do this. They put hundreds of orchards out there across North Carolina and some into Virginia. And we got a lot of attention. That upper left photograph you see, that is Martha Stewart out there with Jane Morgan Smith, one of our growers. She came to be the executive director for the North American Truffle Growers Association for many years with her truffle dog there. The person in the lower right, that is Tom Michaels. He is of Tennessee truffles. He became very famous, was written up in the New York Times. Now that's Dr. Tom Michaels. His background was mycology. He was also trained, did all of his graduate work at Oregon State, where he studied under some of the truffle masters. So he really knew his stuff. And wow, everything seemed fantastic. Our truffles were in very, very high demand. The finest restaurants were using those. That's Tom Michaels with the chef from Blackberry in Tennessee. Everything looked like it was going fantastic. So, why don't we have truffle orchards everywhere? And why don't Jane and Tom have truffles anymore? There's a couple reasons. It takes a long time to get truffle production. Where we are originally told to be about 5 years, it's more like 7, 9, 10 years before you get your first truffles. And in the meantime, you have to weed, irrigate, prune, mow, spray. You're putting a lot of time and a lot of money into that orchard for a really long time. So it's expensive. There's uncertainty. And as long as there's uncertainty, the prices for these truffles will remain very high. So what I say is if I have 10 people that all start truffles using the same planting stock from the same nursery, trying to do it exactly the same way, 3 of them are going to do great. They're going to produce truffles. 3 to 4 of them are going to produce some truffles, enough that they can say they produce them and they can make value-added products like truffle oil and truffle butter, truffle popcorn. And then we're going to have a few that nothing happens. It just doesn't work and we don't know why yet, which is why we need more research. The biggest reason what took out our industry in the mid-2000s was the Eastern filbert blight. With like so many new crops, and I'm sure you all have worked with like the early vineyards that went in and the hop yards, a lot of times the people that get into these exciting new agricultural ventures have absolutely no agricultural background whatsoever. They're not farmers. And that was definitely the case with truffles. The people that were involved that were experts on mycology, not horticulture. So they went and decided to use filberts, not understanding that we have Eastern filbert blight. And this blight often takes 5 years before it shows up. So it doesn't take out your orchard in year 1 or 2. It shows up much later. Your trees are big, you've invested a lot of time and effort. And what happened to those early growers is they didn't know what to do. First of all, there were no experts to advise them. When they did find someone that knew anything about filberts, and sometimes they went to the nut industry out in Oregon, sometimes they talked to some of our ornamental specialists, they were advised to spray fungicides. Well, our growers were afraid to spray a fungicide because they were afraid of killing the fungus. So basically what they did was just watched their orchards die. And Eastern filbert blight took out the industry. And this is what Tom Michaels' orchards, part of them, eventually looked like. So things were pretty bleak, but there were a couple people still having success. So Franklin and Betty Garland and I mean, they've been bugging me for years to do some research, but I could never find any grant money. So they said, how about if we just put in a demonstration orchard? And they gave us enough trees to establish an orchard at the research station in Waynesville, North Carolina in 2010. And they provided us with inoculated filberts that were supposed to be resistant to eastern filbert blight. So this is us establishing that first orchard, laying out our silt fencing, planting our trees. Now these trees were bigger than just seedlings because the year we established this in 2000, or we're going to establish this in 2009, it would not quit raining. And we were on a heavy clay soil. And I'm like, these things are just going to rot. So although he'd never done it before, Franklin said it was okay for us to pot these up into larger pots. We overwintered them in our ornamental researcher, Tom Ranney's overwintering structure, and we planted them out the next spring. Then we were given a second batch of trees a couple years later, and these were even more resistant. Matter of fact, Franklin called them immune. My pathologist won't let me use that word, so we called them highly resistant to eastern filbert blight. So we had 2 orchards established, one in 2010, one in 2013. And this is just showing you how some of these young orchards grew. You will see that we grow them as a shrub, kind of in a vase form, with a lot of multiple stems. This is very different from the way that you would grow filberts for nut production, where you would prune them more like a peach tree with scaffold limbs. This way, if we need to cut out limbs because of eastern filbert blight, we still have a good tree. And over the years, we have let more and more light into those trees and that orchard, so we've let fewer stems exist. And the nice thing about filberts is, you know, if we get a number of spots of blight showing up, those lesions, we can just cut that tree to the ground, haul all that material out of there, and it'll come right back up. Well, then finally, working with the North American Truffle Growers Association, we got a specialty crop block grant through our Department of Agriculture. And we were awarded 2 years of funding to find a practical and cost-effective way for our growers to monitor the status of their orchards. Because we'd get together at our meetings, which we have twice a year, and some of these growers had been maintaining these orchards for 5, 6, 7 years, and they were like, am I ever going to get truffles? How do I know that anything's even growing there? What we had hoped with this project is that we would be able to come up with a microscopic method, and I envisioned us holding these little workshops across the state and teaching people how to buy a little microscope and check their roots of their trees. Well, this was our team. First of all, these are our growers in the bottom, and I consider them very much of the team. We did a lot of on-farm trials, and it was because of all of their letters that we got the funding. I originally was going to be consulted by Dr. Greg Bonito, who at that point was a postdoc at Duke, but while this grant was being awarded, he took a position at Michigan State. So he still answered a lot of my questions, but we didn't have anyone close by. But fortunately, we had a new pathologist who actually has her office and lab right there at Waynesville. She can see this orchard from her office, and that's Inga Meadows. And Inga just happened to have worked for a year or so in New Zealand, and part of her job was to test the truffles that were brought into that country to inoculate seedlings to make sure that they were indeed tuber melanosporum and not some other truffle species. So she was well prepared to do the PCR work. And then my 2 technicians was originally Kelly Gaskell and then Leo Stefanile. So what my technicians did is they went to new, well-established, and some producing orchards across the state and collect soil and root samples from these orchards. Then Kelly cleaned up all these roots and she examined them under the microscope and of course kept track of, we are then going to match these up with what we got with the DNA analysis. So this is showing you what a lot of those corn dogs looked like on those roots. And then we compared that with the DNA analysis using a PCR method. And what we learned was that we could not reliably and confidently distinguish between different tuber species just using the kind of compound microscope that most people would have access to. Greg Bonito, who is the world expert on wild truffles, said that even for him it could be difficult to distinguish between, say, the tuber lyonii, which is the pecan truffle, and the tuber melanosporum, which is the black Perigord truffle, with just a compound microscope. So you need a higher level of microscope to do that, and that would only be by an expert. Most of us are not going to be able to do this. So we really need that DNA analysis to be done, at least initially. Once we know we've got it, then you can monitor it with your compound microscope. But first you need that definite confirmation that we can only get from the PCR. So we did that kind of analysis, and out of the 7 orchards that we worked with, all but 7 of them tested. Actually, all of them did have T. melanosporum in them, but 6 of them tested out very high. We also found a lot of the native pecan truffles, some scleroderma, and some other mycorrhizae that at this point in time we don't know if they coexist or whether one is competitive to the other. And so it was like, okay, so this is what you do. You go ahead and once every year or 2, you send in these samples, you get them analyzed, and then you can just monitor your orchards with your microscope. Unfortunately, we really couldn't find reputable labs to do this. We found one lab that we have no faith in whatsoever. We talked to some labs about whether they would gear up to do this, but there just wasn't enough business to do so. So Inga got permission from NC State to start a service laboratory. And this has been a really wonderful addition to our industry. We use this lab the same way I use the hops lab at Virginia Tech to do my analysis of hops up there. It's very affordable. Now her prices have gone up, but she only charges what it costs her to actually run the service. We also initiated a couple other unfunded projects in 2017 based on information that we got from experts coming in from other parts of the world, and to develop some preliminary information to help us seek additional funding. One is using a method that is being used it was developed in Spain. It's called Spanish wells, but it's now also being used in Australia. And that is where you take inoculum mixed with a specific specific medium, and that is put in wells specially spaced around the root zone of the tree. So this is a replicated study, but it's very small, and we're still waiting to see if we get positive results or not. A number of the experts said that our orchards were too dense. Our trees were spaced too close together and they were too dark, and we needed to introduce more light. Well, this is where we as the researchers take the risks instead of the growers. The growers are like, you cut out your trees and then we'll see if it works for you. So we went to a section of our orchard and we removed every other tree to see if letting more light in there will increase the number of truffles. So far, we have not seen a difference. As I mentioned, we have to keep the soil pH really high. And when we use lime, every year we are putting tons of lime per acre on these trees. It's expensive, and you know, it just keeps coming down. The soil reactions just keep taking place. Well, one of our agronomists working with the Department of Agriculture has a lot of experience with wood ash. He knows how many gardeners overuse wood ash in their gardens and get the soil pH up really high, and then it takes a really long time to come down. And he's like, I wonder if that would benefit us in these truffle orchards. And with all of the pulp mills and all the wood industry we have around us, we've got a lot of ash. So we've got that study going on right now also, and still we're waiting for results. So there's a lot going on in our orchards. Then in November 2017, while I was actually up in Pennsylvania, Lois Martin came out with her dog, and lo and behold, we found our first truffle. Here is Leo. It was 7 years after we planted that orchard. The soil pH had reached 7.6, and many people from Spain, France, Italy, and Australia have told us that that is the magic number. That's where you first start getting production, and that's what we hit. So that one little truffle got divided up into many small pieces so that every person that had helped with this project and working on the research station could take it home to make something special for Thanksgiving. Since then, we've found more truffles. Now, 2018 was the year that I thought we were going to float away in Western North Carolina. It never quit raining. So a lot of our truffles probably rotted in the ground. But in 2019, the 2019-2020 winter, we found 43 truffles in just our first orchard. So both orchards aren't producing yet. This is just our first orchard. This is what one harvest looked like. We had a food writer and a couple other experts come out, and they walked this orchard, and then they went to a restaurant and had a chef cook with them. But this is what one harvest looked like in January. And if, now our orchard's really tiny, but if we go and extrapolate what we got off our little orchard by year 9 and extrapolate it to an acre basis, we would have harvested 30 pounds to the acre. In April 2020, when I collected this information, our truffles were selling for $1,400 a pound on the market. That would have translated into a gross yield of $42,310 per acre for truffles. Now, those are the kind of numbers that get people all excited. Now, remember, it took us 9 years before we got to that point. The biggest deal from this was the fact that NC State University harvested truffles from the university research orchard. Up until that time, we got a lot of criticism from our institution, others, people in various departments just thought this would never work. It wasn't real. So this is a big deal now that we can say, yep, this will really work. And now we're starting to see this happen at other institutions around the country. We were just one of the first to make it happen within the university. So we're hoping that this will help us secure more funding, and we're looking to collaborate with colleagues in other places such as Michigan and Virginia and California to do some research studies that will help the whole industry. When we had our conference in February, and this year it took place in Charlotte, we found that truffle harvests are now being reported all across the country. It was really fun. So I've been going to these conferences for many, many, many years. And this is the first time when we got to talking about our harvest that so many people from so many different states were reporting success. There were a lot of people that kind of abandoned their orchards, and for many of them, most of the trees died, but not all of them. So there have been people having Lois Martin and her dog come out to check those orchards during truffle season, and my employee Leo has gone along to many of these, and they've had a little bit of success. So there is interest in seeing if we can go ahead and renovate some of these older orchards, start applying lime, start pruning, and just start maintaining them once again. The new president, well, he's not so new anymore, but the president of the North American Truffle Growers Association is Brian Upchurch. And Brian's career was as a nurseryman. When he retired from the nursery business, his young son was the one that got him interested in truffles. And when Brian started learning about it, he just like did a head smack about why, in heaven's name, did you choose to use filberts of all things? So part of what he has been doing is looking for trees that are better suited for our region, that aren't susceptible to the disease that's as devastating as filbert blight, because we do manage to control the filbert blight with spraying, but you know, it's still a constant struggle. So we now have funding. Matter of fact, I communicated with him today about we're going to put in another orchard in Waynesville where we're going to have mixed species. So I've mentioned this organization several times. I encourage you to look up the North American Truffle Growers Association. They do a winter and a summer meeting, and well, there's a couple things really exciting. They always bring in growers and researchers from other countries to share their knowledge, and we eat such incredible food. You really cannot appreciate truffles until true experts cook meals with them. So it's not a cheap conference to attend. And in October, for the first time, we were going to take this conference to the West Coast, to California. And I was kind of going, oh man, I'm not going to be able to afford that. But just today, the notice came out that they've just decided they can't do that. Because of COVID, this is not going to work. So there will still be a conference, but it'll all be virtual and it'll cost $25. So I encourage you to go to their website and check that out. I haven't looked to see if that information's posted yet, but it probably is. In addition, they have been doing webinars throughout the year. This is the first time they're doing that with different experts, many of them who have been our speakers, giving an hour, hour and a half webinar on their area of expertise with truffles. So if I've piqued your interest, if you have people asking about truffles, I strongly encourage you to, well, check out that website, but most importantly, get this book, Taming the Truffle. It's got a few years on it, but it's going to give you the background about the whole physiology, the anatomy, the basics of understanding the truffle. The one here by Ian Hall, that is a great basic book to have. And then we've got Truffle Farming Today by Marcos, who is one of our world authorities, but it comes from Spain. It's a little bit harder to get, but I recommend that one too. But Taming the Truffle, you can just order off Amazon. And with that, I will be happy to entertain any questions. Let me do a stop share there.
Jeanine, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. And there's a couple of comments. If you can see them in the chat box there.
I can. Let me go ahead and scroll up to the top. We had some conversations early on. Let's get past these first ones, the chocolate. Okay, we have Marlon saying filberts were successfully grown in Henderson, Bell County, Kentucky from winter of 96 to 97 till they were transplanted to pit in cattle watering a year ago. Put in cattle watering. No treatment. What varieties of filberts do you now use in Waynesville? So actually, you do have some successful production going on in Kentucky. That's where we've got some of the bigger orchards going on. And her name has just gone from my head. Oh, Phil, you and I talked about this, about having her speak sometime.
Yes, you said her and her daughter, and she's somewhere around Glasgow,
Yeah, so
Kentucky.
we've got Kentucky, and then we've got in Virginia. So Virginia, you've got Piedmont Truffles with Olivia Taylor and her mom, and the Martins, Pat Martin, but it's Martha. Oh, they'll come to me. Anyway, we've got an orchard in Kentucky that is huge, where someone with a lot of money just said, I'm going to try this big. We've had one of those in the eastern part of North Carolina too, but I don't hear much success. So when you ask what variety of truffles, that puts me in an interesting position because all of my, or filberts, I should say, all of the filberts for my program were donated. And that is something that Franklin keeps close. For some reason, probably to reduce competition, he does not share the variety. However, I think that Brian Upchurch could come to my orchard and probably tell himself or one of our ornamental people. But I would just go for a filbert that is highly resistant now to the Eastern filbert blight.
Margaret Townsend.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Not Martha, Margaret. So yeah, you can go and look her up. If you do a Google on her name and truffles, you'll come up with a number of media articles that have been on her, and she's delightful. She just had some money and was willing to take the jump, and for her, I think it's going to pay off because she's done it right. How much do 43 truffles weigh? Right now, our orchards are still in the very, very earliest phases, and our truffles they're really variable. When Olivia Taylor, who's one of the growers in Virginia, she went and worked the Australia orchards last year. All of their truffles looked like they were the size of baseballs, softballs. Ours have not been getting that big. I think we've had one that was like baseball size. So they're variable. And so when you lay out your harvest, you're going to see all different sizes, and then they will have to be graded out. Is there a way for us to tell without a trained dog or pig if we have trees that are inoculated with native truffles? With the native ones, that's a really good question. I am not so much a forager with the native truffles. All the ones that I have found in my orchards, we have found while we've had the dog out there. We'll have to talk to some of our truffle experts, of which we have several within the region that go and do research around the world on native truffles. One is Dr. Todd Elliott, who is from the Asheville area. And yeah, I guess that they still use a dog in their hunting. Good question. Sorry, I don't have the answer for that one. What research is being done on growing the native truffles? That research is being done in Florida. So if you go look up the pecan truffle in Florida, I don't have my notes from the conference, so I don't have his name right in front of me, but they've got a pretty active program going on that. Janet asked, what was the value of the truffles grown in 2019? So I just watched what the market prices were on a global and US basis, and they were ranging between $1,000 and $1,600 a pound for the truffles. And I know the one truffle I brought at the conference, which was not in that league at all, you know, I still paid $50 for just one truffle to take home. A question here, we have native hazelnuts. Would those not have some level of resistance? Actually, I'm not a pathologist, but I'm told that all of our filbert blight was coming from those native hazelnuts. So, yeah. Anybody, do we have anyone here who is a hazelnut expert? I'm a vegetable herbs specialist by training, so I'm not that up on my trees and shrubs. How long do truffles last after harvesting? What we do is we hold them in, like, we often put them in a container with eggs, a plastic container, and we can hold them in a refrigerator for a week or so. And they can also be frozen. So many people will buy them when the prices are good and hold them in the freezer. And I know some of those from the freezer are what they use to train dogs, and that a lot of chefs will use also for certain kinds of dishes. Marlon says the native filberts are not affected, but they're carriers. That would make sense. That would make sense. So yeah, interesting. Could you dehydrate the truffles? We might want to play with that with a pecan truffle. There's probably some kind of law against taking, I'm joking, of course, a black Perigord truffle and dehydrating it. I have not seen that, like we do shiitakes and stuff. I've not seen that done. But what's interesting, what I'll often do when I get truffles from our hunts is I will bring them home and I'll put them in a container with eggs, and just holding them in there with the eggs, that aroma will get into the eggs. So when you make scrambled eggs with them, then it'll have that truffle odor and scent to them. Some people will put them in rice and it will flavor that dry rice, but that's not recommended because that starts to dry out that truffle. Yum. If you can get some this year, I strongly recommend getting it and just experimenting with it a little bit. They're really wonderful. And please check out that North American Truffle Growers Association website. Any more questions or comments? Have any of you visited any of these orchards?
Dr. Davis, I'm assuming, like with anything else, you've probably had people just do a few in their backyard just for their own use. I mean, have many of those been successful, or is it just too many inputs to see success on a real small scale?
Um, so this is something we want to look at, but something that Franklin had always told me before was that you needed a certain number of truffles in, or a certain number of trees. That's interesting. My background is coming and going. A certain number of trees to have a certain density. And the way I visualize it is like a shiitake log. I think all of us have grown shiitake. And the way that you have to densely inoculate a log with shiitake inoculum to outcompete the other decay fungi, wood decay fungi that might be present. So remember, and this is something I didn't mention, there are all kinds of fungi and mycorrhizae already in that soil that are trying to get a place on those tree roots. So one thing we don't do is plant our truffle orchards too close to a wood line. And we used to say 50 feet, and now there's some people saying 100 feet. And you also don't want to plant where there had been trees. So like on our research station where we might have done Christmas tree work, we're being told do not put your demonstration orchards there.
Hmm.
So Franklin had thought, well, I'm going to put our trees really close together, and that's going to help all that mycorrhizae grow together faster and come into fruiting. This is how fast this industry is changing. When all of that work was being done, and actually when I planted my orchards in 2010, that was kind of the best information we were going on. And then in the next couple of years, the research started talking about mating types, and that these truffles have males and females. And some orchards in some part of the world, that's how they'll sell them. It's like, we'll sell you this many trees that are males and this many that are females, or trees inoculated with both. And we're still trying to figure out how important that is, or if truffles are one of these organisms that will change their sex. It's fascinating. We are learning so much as we go along. Did that answer your question? Ken, I went down the rabbit hole on that one.
Oh, no.
So some comments about coming to see our orchards. Yes, our orchards are open to the public. I urge you to bring a group together, and we have probably in the winter time 5 or 6 different organized groups that'll come out, and Lois will come out with her dog and we'll do a truffle hunt. Many of those are done in association with something she's involved in. If she's not, then we'd have to raise some funds to pay her. She does it for me for a reduced rate for the research. But you're welcome to come out, but then also check some of these other orchards that might be in your area and get to know those people. A question about how far down in the ground are the truffles? Our early ones in the season are often near the surface. Matter of fact, Leo found the first one in 2019, that winter, just walking it herself. And it was right there at the surface. We're not so excited about those because those are the ones that'll get frost damage. We like to see them being 3, 4, 5 inches down into the ground, so we actually have to dig for them. Are there truffle growers in Maryland? There used to be, and I don't know if they're still producing or not. If you get up with me, I'll go look up their name. It's Kurt and Claudia. Their name starts with an H, but I can't quite remember if it's Huberts or Hubberts or, yeah, get up with me and I will give you their name. Shad asks about heavy mulching. There's mixed opinion on the mulching. We have had some growers that have put down like a straw mulch at certain parts of the season, but you've got to be careful then that you're not making good habitat for various kinds of rodents who will then nibble on them. Tom Michaels had a real problem with squirrels getting into his. Some people have had trouble with mice. So oftentimes we want that clean culture just to keep the rodents from getting involved. Aaron asks about false truffles. And I don't know what you mean by false truffles. Do you want to unmute and explain what you're talking about there? Maybe not. Okay, I'm not sure what a false truffle is. Could you cage the roots to prevent rodents? I don't know that the rodents haven't been that, okay, I will address that in a minute. I haven't seen the rodents be that much of a problem that I think you would want to do that as a regular practice. We're usually able to prevent them by having a clean culture system. And yeah, there's only been a few growers. Tom Michaels was one of them who really had a problem with like the squirrels. And then if people have put down the mulch. So I don't know that caging them would really be a good option. What might I have said for false truffles? Now there are other truffles out there that we don't want, that aren't good to eat. I don't remember calling anything a false truffle. So yeah, sorry if you can remind me fall truffles. Got it. The summer and fall truffles are the burgundy truffles. And yes, the burgundy truffles are the ones that produce in summer and fall. And most people inoculated trees separately to have those. We're wondering if we can't grow both on the same trees. We don't know that at the present time. But we've got some people just switching over totally to those burgundy truffles because they're easier to grow. They're not as hit or miss as the black Paragord. Marlon, you're mentioning about the filberts from the Cornell Experiment Station. We do have some of the truffle nurseries that are indeed working with some of those varieties that have come from there. And I seem to remember there are some that came from Rutgers also. So lots of interest. Great discussion here.
Any other questions? Okay. If not, Dr. Davis, appreciate it very much. This was excellent. Really hit the spot. A lot of our folks were interested in this topic. Now, is there a mailing list or a newsletter? You mentioned the conference. Is there some type of newsletter or mailing list that they can?
There's that. You can, if you go to my website, the easiest way to get there is ncherb.org. Go to my website. If you do a search in that search bar at the top right, for truffles, you will find some of our truffle information. We talk about our research. And then down at the bottom, there's a section where you can sign up for our newsletter that will let you know about information coming through there. Or if you want to get specifically on just a truffle newsletter from us, send me an email. And then I will put you, we do a MailChimp list that's just truffle stuff. And my email is Jeanine, Jeanine _ Davis at ncsu.edu. And if you just put like mailing list in the subject line, I'll just dash it right off to my employee that it populates that for me.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. But as extension people, it really is a risky business. I spend most of my time talking people out of putting in truffle orchards. You know, it's that risky.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you very, very much for an excellent presentation.
Sure.
And Shad or Jeremy, do you have any comments about our next Mountain Zoom series?
Give me just a second, Phil. I'm pulling up the sheet. The next one that we have is winter preps for beekeepers, and that's going to be taught by Dr. Tammy Potter, who is our state entomologist, or state apiarist. There we go.
And that's next Thursday, right? We don't have another one until next Thursday.
Yeah, it's on the 27th.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again to everybody for tuning in, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing from some of you at some point. So have a good evening, and think about truffles.
Great. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.